Yesterday we had this fantastic celebration of life for Dr. Murphy. How many of you were here for that? Great. So you've already met me. This is the publication we did together. And following on that, I have a forthcoming, hopefully very soon, Perspectives on Nobel laureate Barbara McClintock's publications, 1926 to 1984, a companion volume that I like the cover of this one so much that I used it as a model for the next one. So this should be coming out soon. This is going to be an ebook, and it'll be downloadable and free. So you'll have the early papers that I'm going to be talking about and perspectives on those, many of them written by Cornell faculty and faculty from other places all over the world. So I'm myself looking forward to this coming out because it'll help me finish my biography of McClintock. All right, this talk that I'm going to give you today was originally presented as an invitational talk to the Plant Biology Centennial in June of this year. And plant breeders were out in the field working when I was doing this talk, and there were like 2 people from the plant breeding department who were at my presentation. Mark was one of them, Mark Sorrells. So he said, Lee, you have to come back and do this for the plant breeding department when people are not out in the field. So I said, okay, how about October? It should be snowing by then in Ithaca. So that's what, so this is, if you heard my talk in June, you can leave now. But if you didn't, then I only had half an hour to give it in June, so I have a little bit more time to do this now. I met Barbara McClintock when I was a graduate student at Cornell. I came here in 1971, and I graduated in 1975. I also met Lisa at that time. I took a class that she was teaching when I was taking an advanced plant physiology course, and she taught us how to do tissue culture. I remember that. And it's funny, when you first meet somebody, you really have, you remember things like Margaret, me bouncing into her office. I didn't remember that until she told me about it. She reminded me. Okay, so I met Barbara in Dr. McClintock. I never called her Barbara, but I mean, I talk about her now as if I, called her by her first name, but I never did. So I met Barbara McClintock in 1972. She drove up here in her blue and white. I used to think it was a 55 Ford, but somebody told me it was actually a 55 Mercury, but did the same thing practically. And she drove up, and Harry Stinson was walking back and forth in Bradfield Hall and chewing his nails, and here I am, a first-year graduate student. I'm wondering what the heck what's he worrying about? And Barbara is late, and it turns out that she had a flat tire, and she got out and she changed it. Now remember, this is 1972. She's 70 years old. She changed her tire, got back in the car, called him and said, I'm going to be a little bit late, and then got up here. So that was my first experience meeting Barbara McClintock. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about her early work, and if I could figure out how to use this thing. All right, so here's the outline for the talk. Cornell University is in, anything that I put up here that's in red letters means that she did it at Cornell. Okay, when the blue letters come in, then it should be other places. So she came to Cornell early on. She was a student, she was a faculty member. She did a Guggenheim Fellowship in Germany and Caltech, and then came back to Cornell. She was a Rockefeller Foundation grantee at Cornell. She went to the University of Missouri, came back to Cornell every summer to do research because she couldn't stand being out in Missouri. It was too hot for her, as you would know. She was a National Research Council fellow. I'll tell you about that. Her home base was Cornell. She was an assistant professor at Missouri, came back to Cornell in the summers, and then we brought her back, fortunately, when I was a graduate student, as an A.D. White visiting professor. And then she came back for the Synapsis reunion, which some of you may remember. Okay, so I'm going to go through that fairly quickly and see how I can do. So here's what the Cornell campus looked like when Barbara was here. This is a picture from the 1926 Plant Sciences Congress. And as you can see on top, I say that she got her BS in agriculture. Plant breeding and botany. She listed plant breeding first on her record card. Plant breeding and botany. She then did a master's in botany in the botany department. And a Ph.D. in the botany department as well, with a minor in plant breeding. Okay, so that's what the campus looked like. Obviously, the downtown campus, downstate campus. Okay, so here's a picture of Barbara McClintock that I took from Keller's book. This is a picture of her when she had longish hair, curly. She must have had a permanent or something. I never remember her with curly hair. Notice she has a cigarette in her hand, and she's wearing those famous glasses. It's a great picture. And so she was born in 1902, died in 1992. So she lived to be age 90. Born in Hartford, Connecticut, raised in Brooklyn, New York. So we had a lot in common because I was also raised in Brooklyn, New York. She didn't have a Brooklyn accent like I do. She had a Connecticut accent. And in 1923, she was awarded a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture. Bachelor of Science in Agriculture, you like that? With a concentration in plant breeding and botany. Okay? All right, so let me tell you a little bit about her early professors, because she felt that her early professors had a big influence on her going on into science. She actually came here to study. She wanted to do physics, but physics was not in the ag school, and it was too expensive. So she was in the ag school because she didn't have money to go to the arts college, even though her father was a doctor, a medical doctor. Back then, medical doctors did not have the money, make as much money as they do now. They had their homes and offices in their homes, and so her father didn't have a lot of money. So she went to the College of Agriculture at Cornell. All right, so her undergraduate courses and professors, I'll tell you a little bit about them. H.D. Reed was the professor and chair of zoology department. That was in the Arts College. And in her freshman year, she took zoology, 2 terms of zoology. It was called General Zoology with Reed. And Reed studied the vertebrates of Cayuga Lake Basin. He published that in 1909. He studied with August Weismann, who was a proponent of the germplasm theory, as you probably remember. And he became a member of McClintock, eventually became a member of McClintock's Ph.D. committee. Okay. J.R. Schramm was the editor of the Botanical Abstracts, which was started here at Cornell. And then, he became the founding editor of Biological Abstracts in 24 to 37. And she took general botany with him for 2 terms. And I just put up here the required courses. There were 45 credits that were designated required courses, 75 credits of electives during this time, and 20 credits were permitted in the non-ag school. So she took courses down in zoology and physics because she was allowed. It didn't cost her anything extra. Notice that here it says New York State Agricultural College at Cornell, free tuition to New York State residents. All right, so that's the reason she told us that she came here, because it was free. And then this is just from the bulletin, just it says, free tuition for New York State residents. So Schramm, you might know his work. He didn't stay here very long. He left in 25, I believe it was, and but he was here, and he invited her to submit articles to Botanical Abstract later, and I found a whole bunch of them that she did. Okay, this is the big guy from plant breeding, all right? C.B. Hutchison. C.B. Hutchison encouraged McClintock to continue in genetics. She took his course, term 1, junior year, 1921-22, plant breeding 1. Plant breeding 1 was genetics. And it was taught by Hutchison. The prerequisite was botany 1, general botany, plant phys, or equivalents in zoology and physiology. She didn't have the prerequisite, well, she actually had zoology, but not the physiological part. But so she had to get permission to take this course, and she did get permission to do it. She told us that, well, I'll give you the next slide. She said that he was this incredible teacher. And I'll tell you some of the things that he said that she told us about. He considered genetics a subdivision or phase of biology not confined to one or the other kingdom. His course gave less consideration to the presentation of information and more to the development of habit and desire for real thinking. This was Barbara's forte here. Better teaching would result if courses were designed for the purpose of real mental training rather than for giving out a lot of half-digested facts to be handed back in the same undigested form at examinations. Hutchison, 1921, he published this. Okay? So you can see why she would have loved this guy, you know? And she got an A in the course, and he encouraged her to go on and take the graduate course. So the graduate course was taught by Professor Fraser. And he was a professor of plant breeding. He got his degree at Cornell. He was a member of McClintock's Ph.D. committee. And she took the advanced genetics course. The prerequisite was plant breeding 1, genetics, botany, cytology, plant physiology, and permission to register. Now, she didn't have cytology at this time. So she took it concomitantly with this class. And she said that Fraser was an outstanding teacher. So all these Cornell professors who she admired and actually tried to emulate helped McClintock on her way to becoming a great geneticist. Okay, now, this was the person who became her major professor. And I love him because, look at him, he's like so independent. I'll show it. Everybody else is wearing a suit. Look what he's wearing. I mean, this guy was cool, right? So she took Botany 10, which was cytology. At the same time, it was a prerequisite to advanced genetics, but she took it at the same time. He wrote the first introduction to cytology in 1921. He then published the second edition in 26 and the third edition in 34. If you've ever seen the 34 edition, all of McClintock's incredible contributions are in that book. Some of the stuff that isn't even published elsewhere you can find in this 1934 edition of Sharp's book. Okay, I call him the witty nonconformist. He wrote this paper about Eoornis. Are you guys familiar with the Eoornis? It was a spoof. He wrote this spoof about this bird, which he called the woof and poof bird, and it was published in 1928, and people thought it was a real thing, and they cited it. You know, it's like, oh, they found this bird in the Gobi Desert, and no, it was a total joke. He had this great sense of humor. So she got along really well with Sharp, and Sharp was behind her 100% in everything she wanted to do. Okay, so Sharp was also the major professor to Harry Creighton, and as I'll tell you, Barbara and Harry worked very closely together. So Sharp was also on the Ph.D. committees of Emerson's students, and you all know who Emerson was, and those students were George Beadle and Marcus Rhodes. So Marcus Rhodes and George Beadle came to Cornell to work with Emerson, and Emerson sent them over to Sharp, and Sharp sent them to McClintock to learn cytology and cytogenetics. Oh, actually, they started cytogenetics here. Okay, so the question everybody asks me, was Barbara McClintock denied a major in plant breeding? This is where Dr. Murphy came in and helped me find all the documentation I needed to say, probably not. Do you see how I'm hedging here? Okay. I said, hey, as for Cornell, I would found an institution where any person can find instruction in any study. How could people say she wasn't allowed to be a major in plant breeding? Well, it turns out that when McClintock was admitted to Cornell Graduate School, I went down and I found her files down there, and she actually never filled out an application to apply to come and work in plant breeding. I found her original application to Cornell Graduate School, and she she requested a major in cytology with a minor in plant breeding. So I asked Dr. Murphy, well, what do you think happened here? And I asked Harriet Creighton too. What happened? Why do people think she wasn't allowed to major in plant breeding? And they explained to me that back then, the plant breeding department, or not just the plant breeding department, but all faculty were responsible for getting their students jobs. Okay? And I remember even when I came to Cornell, I wanted to major in paleobotany. And I went to see Dr. Banks, and he said, there are no jobs in paleobotany. You do not want to major in paleobotany. And he discouraged me. I mean, if I had insisted, he would have allowed me to do it. But he discouraged me, okay? And so Harriet Creighton, and Murph said she was probably discouraged because Emerson probably wouldn't have been able to find her a job as a woman. And I said, well, why not? Well, back then, the plant breeders went out in the field to work with the farmers. Do the farmers want to take their advice from a woman? Probably not. Okay, so cytology was a great field for women to study. And so she could minor in plant breeding, but probably was discouraged. But I have no documentation to show that she applied to the plant breeding department and was rejected. Okay? So that's what I can say. Probably not. All right. Where did Barbara live when she was on campus? She lived in Risley. She also lived in various other places, but eventually she lived in Risley. In June of 1923, she was awarded her BS in agriculture with a concentration in plant breeding and botany, and she completed the first term of her graduate school. So she was actually in graduate school at the same time, but she needed her residency in order to graduate. And the reason is that you could graduate a semester early if you had really outstanding grades. However, she didn't have those outstanding grades. She had good grades, but they weren't enough to get her over the hump to graduate a semester early, so she had to hang out. Okay? I have only found that because I found her registrar's card down in the archives. Okay, so just to show you women in plant breeding, okay? This is the Synapses Club, 1923. And Dr. Sharp is a member of the Synapses Club. And Dr. Fraser is here, Dr. Emerson here. And who's this woman? We got a woman in plant breeding? She was Dr. Emerson's student, okay? And her name was Helen Trakovich. She got a master's in plant breeding in 1923. Her advisor was Emerson, the chair of the plant breeding department, who was not anti-female, okay? So, how come she wasn't discouraged? Any ideas? She had come from Russia and was married to a guy who was going to go back to Europe to work. So Emerson figured, I could probably let her come in here and she could get her degree and I don't have to find her a job. She's going to go back to Europe, and she did. But she didn't stay there very long. She actually came back to America later. But she got her degree, her master's in plant breeding in 1923, the same year as Barbara McClintock got her bachelor's degree. Okay? There's another woman I'll point out to you too. So let me tell you just a little bit more about Barbara. She came here, so she got the graduate scholarship in botany, 1923-24. That was what she did when she finished her bachelor's. And then she was elected to Sigma Xi, the Graduate Student Honor Society. She took Botany 14, which was morphology of bryophytes and vascular plants, with Eames and Sharp. Okay, so she continued to take courses. And she did a master's thesis which had nothing to do with corn. Okay, so everybody's talking about, Barbara McClintock studied corn as an undergrad and a first-year graduate student. Did not happen. Okay? She did not study the corn plant as an undergraduate, nor morphologically describe its chromosomes, although both stories have been circulated incorrectly. Okay? She did a resume of cytological investigations of the cereals with particular attention to wheat. Now, why did she do that for a master's? Sharp said, listen, there's a student in plant breeding who's doing a study on wheat. I need you to do some background work for him. That's why she did that project, okay? But she was bored with it. Okay, now, in 1924 through 1926, she was a research assistant to L.F. Randolph. Now this, I call this my Mutt and Jeff picture. Here's Randolph. I think he's like 6'2" or something. Those people who knew Randolph, can you tell me how tall he was? He was pretty tall. This is Richie, who's a USDA guy, and there's Barbara in the middle. They're standing outside Stone Hall, which doesn't exist anymore. But I remember when Stone Hall was up there. So he was an associate cytologist at the USDA, and in the summer of 1925, Barbara McClintock discovered a triploid corn plant having 3 sets of chromosomes, as you know. And they studied the meiotic behavior of these chromosomes at anaphase and diakinesis, not pachytene. Pachytene doesn't come till much later, all right? They studied this in the pollen mother cells of the plant. They described tetraploid microsporocytes, and they suggested that functioning gametes derived from such cells might account for the origin of triploidy and other forms of polyploidy. So this was a really important paper. Now, the problem with this paper is that Barbara felt she had done most of the work, but her name wasn't first. Her name was second on the paper. She was really upset. She said, I am not working for this guy anymore. He didn't put my name first on the paper. I did the work, and that's it. So she goes to Sharp and she says, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm not working for him. And Sharp said, okay, I'll find you something. Work with me. You can be my teaching assistant. So that's how she became a teaching assistant in plant biology, okay? They ended their working relationship soon after this, right? And she looks real happy because she's working for Sharp. Okay, that's a picture Harriet gave me. Okay, so here she is at Cornell in the botany department, and I just wanted to show you quickly that who the botany faculty were, and Roger Spanswick, if he's still here, will recognize some of these people. So this is Carl Wiegand, who was chair of the botany department. He was behind her. He allowed her to switch over, become a teaching assistant with Dr. Sharp. And this is Curtis, who she finally took plant physiology with as a graduate student, and Dr. Eames, who she eventually co-taught with. So she did her Ph.D. dissertation working on the triploid corn plant, and it was an investigation of the cytogenetics of the triploid plant, which then crossed with a normal, produced offspring with extra chromosomes, trisomic plants. Okay, now this was really important because if you get a trisomic plant, then if you can figure out which chromosome is which, you can then put the genes with the chromosomes. All right, but they didn't know which chromosome was which at this time. They just knew that there was an extra chromosome and it gave you a phenotypic expression, okay? So this is just a quick slide. Don't read it. It just shows all the important people who were in the plant biology department. I had to do this because this was a plant biology talk, so we'll skip that. Okay, so here's some landmark books that came out, and the important ones that I want to show you are Sharp's book from 1921, Introduction to Cytology, and Carl Wiegand wrote The First Flora of Cayuga Lake. Introduction to Plant Anatomy was Eames and McDaniels. These are all fabulous teachers who wrote fabulous textbooks during this time period. And of course, Barbara was here at this time. Okay, so here she is in 1926 at the 1926 International Congress of Genetics, and Sharp was the secretary of that. She was in charge of cytological demonstrations, and eventually, as I said, she got her PhD, which allowed her to correlate these extra chromosome plants. So here she is. This is a picture of her. She's wearing a dress. How about that? And she's got like a flapper dress on. And here's Dr. Sharp with the rest of the group. So I wanted to show you how he's not dressed like everybody else. There's Dr. Randolph in the corner. Okay. So Barbara graduates with this, her degree, and she still hasn't identified the corn plants yet. She knows that this is what she wants to do, a corn chromosome, sorry. She wants to identify the corn chromosome, so she says she's going to hang on and stay at Cornell. She was appointed an instructor at Cornell. And during that time, when you were an instructor in the early days, you had faculty rank. You were on the road to tenure, okay? And this afforded her, oops, sorry. This was important because when she left to go get a job elsewhere, the faculty status that she had as an instructor at Cornell allowed her to gain the years that she needed towards tenure, okay? So she did have faculty status with teaching responsibilities and guiding graduate students. And this is, if any of you remember these buildings, this is Stone Hall, and this is Roberts and East Roberts, okay? And then the plant breeding department, plant breeding building hadn't been built yet, all right? So, plant science building, sorry, hadn't been built yet. Okay, so where was Barbara? I hope you guys can see this map. This is a 1918 map of the campus, and the red arrow shows Stone Hall, okay? And this is Rice Hall. Now you know where that is. And this is where plant breeding was when Barbara took her graduate courses. So they were kind of a distance apart. And so when Emerson said to Rhodes and Beadle, I want you to go over to plant breeding to learn cytology, they had to give them space in Stone Hall so that they didn't have to keep going back and forth. Okay? So they were huddled together in this room in Stone Hall, Beadle and Emerson and all these other guys who she eventually worked with until the plant science building was built. And then they sort of separated. Plant breeding was on the first floor and plant biology was on the second floor of plant science. Okay? So what did she teach? She taught cytology, discussion and lab review, new literature. Lectures were added in 1927. Botany, history of botany. She taught that. Plant anatomy, graduate course with Eames and Petrie, methods in histology and cytology, a graduate course. She taught all those courses when she was here at Cornell. And Beadle took cytology with her. So she taught him cytology. Okay, now let's talk about the 10 chromosomes of maize. In 1927, instructor McClintock continued to pursue her studies on the triploid corn plant and its trisomic offspring. Plants with extra chromosomes could be used for correlating genes with their chromosomes if you could cytologically distinguish each chromosome. The late prophase and metaphase in the first microspore mitosis provided clear chromosome observations. And by June of 1929, McClintock published the first ideogram of the maize chromosome. 1929. How many years had she already had her Ph.D.? 2 years. She didn't do this as an undergrad. She didn't do this as a graduate student. She did it as a Ph.D. instructor in the botany department. Okay? All right, I'll show you the pictures of these things in a minute. Now, here's where we get Dr. Emerson comes into the picture. As you know, he was head of the plant breeding department from 1914 to 1941. He established the School of Plant Genetics at Cornell, which I say is a milestone comparable to T.H. Morgan's School of Drosophila Genetics at Columbia. Barbara McClintock provided guidance and leadership to Emerson's students and postdocs. That's the famous picture, I'll show you in a second. So it was George Beadle, Marcus Rhodes, Charlie Burnham, Harriet Crichton, all were here when Barbara was an instructor in the plant biology department. And Emerson, as I told you, sent his students there to learn cytology, because that's where cytology was taught. Okay, so here's the famous picture that we all know and love. And every time I find this picture on the internet, it's always mislabeled, and they say Emerson was Barbara McClintock was Emerson's graduate student, which now you know he was not. Also, that this is a group of his graduate students, which is not true, because his graduate students were Marcus Rhodes and George Beadle and his dog. And here's Charlie Burnham, who came from Wisconsin as a postdoc with Emerson. And here's Barbara as an instructor, okay? So that's the miscommunication on, so if you see that on the internet, don't believe it. So they were together in 1929 and did great things, which I'll tell you about in a second. So linking genetics and cytology, recognizing each chromosome individually allowed researchers to identify genes with their chromosomes, and observing genetic ratios in her trisomic plants and comparing the ratios with plants having extra chromosomes, seen with the microscope. McClintock cooperated and guided students to determine the locations of many genes, now that she was actually able to know which chromosome, to identify which chromosome was which. So she worked with Henry Hill, who was actually a student in plant biology, and they were the first to identify the RG linkage group with the smallest May's chromosome, chromosome 10, and they published that in 1931. And the reference is down below. Okay, now Charlie Burnham brought with him from Wisconsin stocks that McClintock used to observe pieces of one chromosome attached to another, which we call interchange chromosomes, when the pollen grains are produced during meiotic cell division. So she used so this is meiosis. Now she's looking at packaging, okay? And this doesn't happen until around 2930. She used these translocation or interchange chromosomes, which she found that packaging of meiosis, to locate the remaining 4 genes with their chromosomes. And these cooperators also confirmed Belling's translocation hypothesis, which offered an explanation of how translocations confer semi-sterility. And that's why Burnham came to Cornell. He and Brink found semi-sterile corn plants in their populations at Wisconsin, and they didn't know what the basis for them was, but they hypothesized from Belling's work that these were translocations, and they proved it when he got here, okay? So, landmark publications in plant cytogenetics, Randolph and McClintock, first report of triploid corn. McClintock 29, the first ideogram of the corn chromosomes, illustrating the 10 haploid chromosomes in the first mitotic division of the gametophyte. McClintock 30, first cytological description of packaging chromosomes in corn. McClintock and Hill, first paper linking a gene to a chromosome. So these are these early papers that were done here at Cornell. Okay, just some pictures of what I'm showing you here. The A is the mitotic May's chromosome, the trisomic N+1 chromosome. Here's the 2 extra chromosomes, and that you can find in McClintock and Hill, and also in Sharp 1934, which I told you republished that. Now, the ideogram of mitotic May's was published in Science, and here it is. This is chromosome 10. This is chromosome 1. Now we write it the other way around, but that's the way she did it at that time. And here is the first picture of meiotic May's packaging chromosomes, which were described in 1930 without the picture, and then published with the picture in 1933. Okay? So that shows you where the documentation for that. Okay, now the proof of crossing over. Here's the other great thing that you guys know about with McClintock at Cornell, and that is Crichton comes to Cornell, and again, here's another Mutt and Jeff picture. McClintock was about 4'11". I mean, do you guys remember how short she was? And I used to be 5'7". I'm now like 5'4.5" or something. But I remember the first time meeting her, looking down at her like this. And, so it was much more comfortable to just sit down with her because she didn't really want to be towering over Barbara McClintock. Anyhow, so she figured out the order of the genes of C, SH, and WX in Zia. With a reference to cytologically known points in the chromosome. She published that in PNAS. And she then gave this project to Harriet. It was her PhD thesis, correlating the first demonstration of crossing over at the cytological level. They used a semi-sterile maize plant associated with reciprocal translocations, again, the one that Charlie Burnham brought with him. So they wanted to have his name on the paper. She said, "No, I didn't do anything. I just brought the stocks. It's your paper." So they published these 2 papers, And one of the things that I have a problem with people citing these papers is they cite Crichton and McClintock 1931, and they don't realize that that was only part of the story, because these two papers came out as one reprint. So if you read Crichton and McClintock 1931, they refer to a previous paper, and they don't cite it. The previous paper means previous in the journal. So you're supposed to look at the 1931 paper that McClintock wrote on the order of the genes. Otherwise, that 31 paper from Crichton and McClintock doesn't make sense. And so people have criticized this paper because they didn't realize that they were supposed to read both of them together. Okay? Okay, I went and I interviewed Harriet Crichton, and I talked with her at Wellesley College. And she's the one who said to me, I was telling her about how, oh, so exciting that Barbara McClintock found packaging chromosomes. And she goes, no, that's wrong. It wasn't packaging. She did it in mitosis. So she's the one who helped me with that. And she couldn't believe how many citations there were for this paper. I mean, I was telling her about that. Then she came back with Barbara in 1982 to the Synapsis reunion, and this is them fooling around there. Some of you may remember that picture. So she became head of botany at Wellesley College and president of the Botanical Society of America, and taught cytology and the cytology that she learned here at Cornell, got her Ph.D. at Cornell, on this particular important paper. Okay, now, up until this point, I'm not mentioning transposons, am I? Nothing about transposons. Everybody knows McClintock about transposons. This woman is famous without transposons. Forget them for a minute. Okay, in the dynamic genome, which was a gift to Barbara McClintock on her 90th birthday, Nina Fedorov commented on McClintock's early achievements. The influence of her early work is greater than that of any of her peers. Had she done no more, McClintock would have become a major figure in the history of genetics. All done here at Cornell. Okay? However, we know she did a lot more, right? And I'll tell you about that as quickly as I can. Okay, I wanted to spend time on the early stuff. All right, so then she leaves Cornell temporarily, and she becomes a National Research Council Fellow at Missouri. And L.J. Stadler, this is L.J. Stadler from the 1926 Congress, he was a postdoc with Emerson. She got to know him when he was a postdoc with Emerson, and he had great respect for her cytology and her work that she did. And she was invited by Stadler to study his mutations in X-rayed plants, and found that the external phenotype traits were caused by missing pieces of chromosomes in the cell. And she did that with her pachytenes, and she was able to identify specific places where the genes were located on the chromosomes by using his X-rayed plants. Okay, she also observed ring fragments in maize, which she hypothesized the mechanism for producing ring chromosomes and published that. And by 1932, she correlated ring chromosomes with variegation, which occurred both spontaneously and in X-rayed maize plants. And this is the beginning of starting to look at transposable elements, okay? So it goes back that far. Well, you can't really understand Barbara McClintock's transposable elements and where they came from and how she understood them until you read her early papers, which you will be able to very soon. Okay, so then she does all that at Missouri, and then she goes on to Caltech. She's invited by E.G. Anderson. This is the best picture I could find of him. Sorry, guys. If you can find a better picture of E.G. Anderson, it would be good for me. E.G. Anderson, who got his Ph.D. with Emerson here at Cornell, and was invited by Morgan to go to Caltech and be a professor there. She's invited by Ernest Gustav Anderson, and while she's there, she finds the first mechanism for translocations between non-homologous chromosomes. And she employs the interchange chromosomes to investigate the nucleolar organizer while she's at Caltech, and those are the references. And then in 1932, she comes back to Cornell, and is the International Congress of Genetics is hosted here at Cornell, 1932. And there's a picture of it right here of the living corn map. And they grew, and we did that again when we had our centennial. And Emerson presented a summary of progress in maize genetics. McClintock's work is featured in this talk. Okay, all the great things that she did. If you read, you can go back and you can read that paper. Okay. So at Cornell, McClintock continued working on ring chromosomes with the material supplied by Stadler, and she goes off and is a Guggenheim Fellow in Berlin, and doesn't stay there very long, but she does publish her nucleolar organizer paper while she's there, and she comes back. And she says, well, now I don't have a job. Here it is, 1933, 34, the height of the Depression. And not only did she not have a job, Beadle didn't have a job, Rhodes didn't have a job, Burnham didn't have a job. She's not the only one who didn't have a job. Okay, so Emerson said, and she says to Emerson, I'm going into another field, I don't have a job. I'm going to study meteorology. And he says to himself, oh my God, you cannot do this. I've got to get a job for you. So he contacts the Rockefeller Foundation. He says, you've got to give me money to hire McClintock in my department so she can continue work, because he understood how important her work was. So she gets this Rockefeller Foundation grant, and the project that she works on was the ring chromosome work, and which provided insights to an understanding of variegation, and which led to studies of the breakage-fusion-bridge cycle, which eventually then allowed her to find transposable elements. So these are, on the bottom, just some references to some of the important early papers that she does while she's at Cornell. And here she is with the 1934 through 1936. She's with the Synapses Club here. Here's McClintock in the middle. And there's some other women in the picture, and they came because they wanted to be associated with Barbara. And this picture is in our book, Murphy and Kass, if you want to see who's identified who. But I just want to show Barbara in the middle. She's the research assistant to Emerson, but Emerson let her do whatever the heck she wanted to do. You know, whatever you want to do, Barbara, just do it. You know, get your work out. So this is what she accomplishes, okay? This is why I call my impact slide. So these papers, 1931, Crichton and McClintock, which I mentioned, and then, so these are papers she did. The blue is what she did outside of Cornell, and then the rest is, again, Cornell papers that she publishes. During this time period, she does a review with Rhodes, the cytogenetics of maize, summary of linkage in maize in Emerson, Beadle, and Fraser, very important paper, monograph. Crichton and McClintock, 35, and all these, you've got to look at Sharp 1934 to see all these extra things that she never published, but what is in that book, okay? Okay. So then she goes to Missouri. She gets invited by Stadler. She finally gets a job, a full-time job. She gets invited by Stadler to be a professor at Missouri. And here is, here's George Sprague, here's Barbara McClintock, and Stadler's in the back here. And here's where she does the breakage-fusion-bridge cycle, when she's at Missouri. Okay, and here she's got plants with dicentric ring-shaped chromosomes produce chromosome bridges at mitotic anaphase, losing genetic material and uncovering recessive traits in the cells that are descended. The systemitotic cells gain genetic material that was lost in the breakage of the chromosome bridge. Broken chromosome ends fused again to reform a ring, and that's the breakage-fusion-bridge cycle. Okay? The repeated losses resulted in variegated plant tissue due to the continual uncovering of recessive traits. All right, so she does all that while she's at Missouri, hating it every minute because she's teaching and it's taking away all of her time from research. And, but she's a great teacher, her students loved her. And then it's hot and she can't stand the heat. Harriet told me she couldn't stand the heat. And she comes back to Cornell in the summers to do her research. And Emerson says, whatever you want, I'll give it to you. You want to plant corn here? Fine, we'll plant your corn here. So here's Stadler's research group. We don't have to go through that. So McClintock's studies of the breakage-fusion-bridge cycle while at Missouri and Cornell were the major source of chromosome rearrangements that allowed her to study the behavior of broken chromosomes, leading to the discovery of transposable elements in maize. Okay? Again, papers that she published between 36 and 41, while she's teaching, doing all this work, and writing letters to writing letters to Rhodes and writing letters to Burnham and saying, I don't have time for my research. I'm teaching too much. So that's another reason why she wanted to get out of that place. So this is just quickly her papers. The red is published through Cornell. The blue is published through Missouri. Okay, by 1940, Stadler's research group was threatened with termination. When he considered leaving the university, Morgan wanted him. Morgan said, come to Caltech. And Barbara says, you son of a SOB, you brought me out here, and now you're leaving me stranded? She was so mad at him. So she requested a leave of absence to seek employment elsewhere because he was on sabbatical, and she said, I'm out of here. And guess what? Another student from Cornell, Miloslav Demrick, is going to become the director of the Cold Spring Harbor Genetics Department. And so he invites her out there and says, Barbara, you come here on your sabbatical, you work here, and I'll get you a job. And that's exactly what he did. Okay, so she knew this was imminent, right? So she takes a leave of absence. She goes and visits Cold Spring Harbor in 1941. In 1942, she was offered and accepted a full-time research appointment at the Department of Genetics. And she resigns from Missouri in August of 42. All right? So those of you who teach a lot and want to do your research, you can be empathetic with Barbara. Okay? McClintock's studies of the breakage-fusion-bridge cycle exposed, this is the way she described it, innate mechanisms that initiated genome organization. The full extent of their effects was not appreciated until the summer of 44 and thereafter. She wrote that in 1978, leading to her Nobel Prize-winning discovery of genetic transposable elements, mobile genetic elements, in maize. So she started that work here at Cornell, went to Missouri, did it at Missouri, goes to Cold Spring Harbor, finds the transposable elements, and they take credit for all of it. Okay? So, in 1965 through 1974, we invite her back here. She's still not a famous person, except at Cornell, right? In 65. McClintock is sponsored by Adrian Serb, who I think at that time is just about still in plant breeding and about to go over to plant genetics and development. The new section of genetics development and physiology, that's where I got my degree. The section doesn't exist anymore. In the Division of Biological Sciences, that doesn't exist anymore. Harry Stinson was the chair of the department. He sponsored her, and he's the one I told you about was biting his nails when she was trying to come up here. And she is invited to be an A.D. White professor, and she accepts. Okay? Fortunately for me, because I get to meet her, and fortunately for you, as students, graduate students, we met with her, and she only wanted to meet with the graduate students. She didn't want anything to do with the professors. She said the professors were too narrow-minded. Let me talk to the students. So the section GDP includes most botanists from the former Department of Botany, 3 geneticists, Serb, Stinson, and Bruce Wallace from plant breeding. Okay? So she's comfortable with them. She knew them. And so she comes here, and the rest of the story very quickly is that she gets recognition in 1957. She's awarded the Botanical Society of America Merit Award. The University of Missouri honors her in 1968 with an SCD, honorary SCD. Okay? And she's still, her transposable element story is still sort of in limbo. And she comes back in 1982. Here's the synapses reunion. Here's Barbara in the middle. I circled her. A lot of people in the audience here, some people in the audience here are in this picture. Some of them are long up in heaven now. But it's 1982. She still hasn't gotten recognition, right? Although she's beginning to get recognition for the transposable element story. And then here's the synapses reunion speakers. Here's Marcus Rhodes, Charlie Burnham, Barbara, Harriet, George Sprague, and Harold Perry, who was the best man at his wedding. I just learned that. Anyway, so that's their, their famous group picture. And then the next year, right after Synapsis, 1983, she's awarded the Nobel Prize. And it was Marcus Rhodes and a bunch of people who knew her over the period of a very long time who put in that award for her. Okay? So that's Barbara. And we have, as you know, the Emerson building, the building that we call the McClintock Shed, and has this ugly plaque on it, which we're going to fix, I'm hoping. The plaque was the courtesy of Ronnie, and when we delegated somebody whose name I'm not going to mention to do this plaque, and when we saw it, we were kind of disappointed, so we're trying to get another one. But the legacy of Barbara McClintock is that's the McClintock Shed, and we have 2 Barbara McClintock professors, June Nasrallah and John Liss, and there are 3 others who, there is room for 3 others. There were 5 designated. So designate some more Barbara McClintock fellows. Okay, so that's her legacy at Cornell. The plant science building, I was hoping we could get a plaque on the 2nd floor where she worked in the cytology lab, but it's been renovated, so we can't do that anymore. But we may be able to do the shed. And now you see that why I want to do these papers, because all of her early work was really, really important. Okay, I'm done.